How many actual school shootings were there in the last academic year?
So if you define a school shooting as any time a firearm is discharged in a school, then you're talking over 200 times. But if you're looking at the high profile mass shootings like Uvalde, Texas, or like Parkland, Florida, or Columbine, that most people are thinking about and talking about when we are having these conversations, those are incredibly rare events. So going back through our entire database, all the way to 1966, there are only 13 of those types of cases. And a majority of those have occurred in the last sort of 20 years post-Columbine. But the good news with all this is that those types of just horrific, gut-wrenching tragedies are still rare events, and that schools are still relatively safe spaces for our young people. But unfortunately, too many firearms wind up in schools, and then there are accidental shootings and discharges and fights that escalate and people pull a gun. And that's another concern that many parents and young people have right now, which goes back to, I think, what we talked about before is, in addition to if you see something, say something, and let's have those protocols in place, we also need to have that public health campaign around safe storage of firearms, because it's those stolen guns that wind up in our schools. It's those weapons that shouldn't be in the hands of young people that are causing the problems here.
How much did Uvalde fit the pattern of what we've been talking about?
Yeah, based on what we know about Uvalde so far, it fits it exactly, really. A young person with a history of pretty significant childhood trauma. I think that's still starting to emerge. Who was spending a lot of time online, posting things that were concerning and violent, dropped out of school, behaviors changing. People around him were noticing it. Purchased an AR-15 on his 18th birthday, studied other school shooters and previous school shooters. He really kind of perfectly fit the profile. The only thing that was odd was the fact that he targeted an elementary school.
Right.
But then when we found out, that's likely because that's where a lot of his trauma occurred as a child, was in that exact classroom in fourth grade. So perpetrators tend to pick a target that represents their grievance with the world somehow. And for some reason, he chose that elementary school.
He attended that school?
Yes, that classroom.
That was his classroom. And do we know what happened to him in that classroom?
There's different reports, but there's some reports that he was heavily bullied in that classroom in fourth grade.
By the other students, not the teacher, but the other students?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's been so much said about the delayed or lack of response there by law enforcement. Was there insufficient training there, or have you been able to determine?
The report that came out of Uvalde, I think, made very clear that it was a real failure of leadership, that there was a lack of understanding about who was in charge and who could make the types of decisions that needed to be made that day. And it is heartbreaking to look back on what could have been done that could have saved lives, because if we know, and we have known for a very long time, that law enforcement's job is to get there as quick as possible. And as you mentioned, Dr. Phil, earlier, some of these shootings are over in seconds and in a few minutes. And in this case, it was drawn out, over an hour. And that, I think, contributed to the very high death toll in that particular case. And so I think there will be a lot of looking back at that particular case now and scrutinizing how law enforcement responded so we can learn from it. And so that never happens again.
Right. If we expand beyond school shootings and just look at mass shootings in general, how does the profile change from the school shooter to the mass shooter?
The pathway is actually quite similar in terms of sort of early childhood trauma, the build to the crisis point, online radicalization, leaking plans, suicidality. What's different, I would say, with workplace shooters is they tend to be older. They're more like in their 40s. Oftentimes, their crisis point for workplace shooters is being recently fired from their job. And so they blame that workplace. For other perpetrators who target, places of worship or grocery stores, what happens is that there's this kind of self-loathing, self-hate. There's these young men or middle-aged men who aren't at the place in life that they planned, who don't have what they feel like they deserve in life. And then there's this shift where it stops being kind of what's wrong with me, and it starts being whose fault is this and who can I blame? And so people find targets to blame, whether that's a religious group or a racial group or women or their workplace. And it becomes about taking that anger out. And it's about making sure we all witness that anger. This is a public mass shooting meant to be watched and witnessed, meant to be a way to air their grievances to the world.
But they're okay aggressing against surrogates as opposed to who they actually believe has transgressed against them, true?
Right. Yes, I think that's a good way of putting it.
They'll take somebody to stand in that can represent the establishment or whoever it is the evildoer. There was nobody in that grocery store in New York that this individual had a grievance against. These were just them.
Yeah, and it's a generalized anger. And as we like to say with this, like the hate comes late on that pathway, which is that it's originally the hatred of self that comes first. And it's the anger and frustration that comes with not achieving one's lot in life. And then it's looking for somebody to blame, but it's a very generalized picture of who that person is. So it's not necessarily a specific person. It's just that these are representative of my grievance. And so it might just be women writ large, or it might be African-American patrons at the grocery store, as was the case in Buffalo, because there's a sense that that race is the problem here, and that's where I'm going to target. So,
Right.
So I think that you've articulated that really well, which is it's a generalized hatred. It's not specific.